So a lot of the a lot of the resolutions at the tournament last weekend at Evergreen, well, first of all, seemed to focus a lot on like international politics regarding like East Asia, which is pretty fun. They all had to do with that kind of stuff, but it seemed like, judging by the group chat, which was constantly pinging my phone for the entire weekend. Thank you very much for including me on that. A lot of questions whenever the resolutions came out was, oh, how are we supposed to argue against this? It's a First Amendment issue. How are we supposed to argue against this? It's a constitutional issue. And first of all, like, as we've proved over the last 4 or 5 years, like, the Constitution apparently is a suggestion when it comes to like lawmaking for many people. But secondly, there are so many different ways in which you can argue for or against something based upon constitutionality. You just have to understand what the Constitution actually says and what it doesn't say. All right. So in response to We Have Heard You, in response to a lot of your questionings and your cries of despair, we wanted to like go over some issues of constitutionality today to give you a sense of like how you can understand a resolution that has constitutional implications, how you can argue for or against something. Is that right, Mohan?
Yes, that is correct. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull this up right now. Just give me one sec. Okay, I'll share the screen. Can everyone see that? Great. So today we'll be talking about the First Amendment and debate. And so first of all, let's just read a part of the First Amendment, which is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So let's break this down into a couple categories. First would be freedom of religion. So here are some examples of things that can be questionable within the banner of freedom of religion. So first, let's talk about travel bans. Now, travel bans based on religious affiliation would be considered discrimination on religious grounds, and applies for a preference for alternative religious expressions. And so one of the more famous travel bans would be that, or infamous, would be that of that which occurred during the Trump administration. And that travel ban was not based on religion, but rather it was written down by, the ban was determined by country of origin of the traveler. So although it was based on country, it was taken to court multiple times because of the highly Islamophobic and anti-Muslim sentiment that surrounded the ban throughout the campaign trail and inside of, or within, the presidency of Trump. And it was mainly, so the issue was not that the actual documentation was discriminatory of a religion, but rather the sentiments around it were discriminatory of a religion. And that would be one way that this could be a violation of the First Amendment, because it shows that the government has a discriminatory mindset towards a certain religion.
And in Trump's very first campaign speech, like, he comes down that golden elevator and then he says that Mexicans are rapists and stuff. He also said the words, "I, Donald J. Trump, am calling for a total and complete shutdown on travelers from Muslim countries until we figure out what the hell is going on." That's his exact quote. So because he literally said explicitly, this travel ban is based upon religious grounds, as a campaigner, when he became president later that year and he tried to pass this travel ban, the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security basically justified this ban as saying this ban is based primarily upon country of origin, and security concerns surrounding terrorism of that country of origin has nothing to do with religion. The problem was, of course, it's almost all the countries named were predominantly Muslim, and because the candidate had made statements that called for a ban on countries based upon religious grounds, it's not hard to sort of cross apply and say, well, hold on, even though you're pretending this has nothing to do with religious discrimination, your candidate said a year ago when proposing this ban that it was religiously discriminatory, like it had a religious motivation. And so that's why it was struck down by the courts the first time as being a violation of the First Amendment. Because when you say, I don't want travelers from this religion, you are expressing implicitly a preference for travelers from other religions, which is a government tacit endorsement of religion, of one over another. So that's why it was struck down. The problem was the lawyers went back and did their paperwork a little bit better. Next time, they tried it again. And this time, because their ducks were more in a row, trying to argue that it was a security concern, not a religious thing, the judge let it pass. And that travel ban still exists in our government today.
Yeah, and another thing to keep in mind is that although this travel ban did not affect American Muslims traveling to and from the U.S., the fact that it had so much anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiment around it caused, or was that was the violation, not the fact that it infringed on rights of people in America, but the fact that it showed the favoritism and discrimination within those sentiments and the bill itself. And so now talking about federal funding on things that could be found objectionable based on religious grounds. The first would be Planned Parenthood. So Planned Parenthood receives government funding, but only for certain things. For example, Planned Parenthood, or two things that Planned Parenthood does are perform abortions and provide contraceptives. And so when people realized that there were government funds going towards Planned Parenthood, which carried out abortions, there was a lot of controversy over it because people didn't want their tax money going towards abortions. So the Hyde Amendment was passed, which prevents government funds from being used for abortions. And this was mainly because so many people objected to abortions being carried out with government funds because of religious beliefs. However, contraceptives, which Planned Parenthood gives out, are still allowed to be given out and funded by government money because not as many people object to the use of contraceptions, and not as didn't create as much of a controversy as abortions did. So this is an example of how sometimes things that are objected to from multiple religions and on many different grounds can be seen as a violation of the First Amendment because it's seen as a violation of their religion. Now, another example would be mandatory vaccination. And let me just check the chat, sorry. Yeah, and Avani gave a definition for contraceptives in the chat if you do not know. So another example would be mandatory vaccination. And although some religions may object to the use of medicines and vaccines, they must still contribute to the widespread use of them. So they're not going to mandate that you actually take a vaccine. The government has not mandated that, or the federal government has not mandated that. However, they can mandate that your tax dollars can go to that, and your and so on. So similarly, for the National Selective Service, also known as the draft, although you can get a religious exemption to not go to war, if there was a draft, for example, Muhammad Ali did not fight in the Vietnam War because he cited religious reasons preventing him from fighting. You cannot exempt yourself from the taxes that you pay, which go towards the Selective Service. And then Mr. Kistler, are you able to kind of elaborate on letter D? Mr. Kistler?
Yeah, sorry, I just did something that I should not have done.
No worries.
No, sorry, I can see it now. All right, so non-discrimination laws which force employers to hire those with lifestyles they find objectionable on religious grounds, such as LGBTQ, non-religious employees, etc. So, freedom of religion says, right, that you cannot be, the government shall make no law establishing religion, but also not prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This has allowed certain organizations like churches, parachurch organizations, and private schools, like Valley Christian, for example, to argue that discriminatory hiring practices, such as we will not hire non-Christians or we will not hire gay people, is protected. Like in any other industry, it's against the law to discriminate against people based upon religion, gender, sexual preference, etc. Right? There's all these protective laws that you can't be like fired from a job from being gay. The problem is at schools or any other organization which have a religious flavor to them, that right not to be discriminated against comes into conflict with that organization's supposed right towards religious freedom. And so if they can argue that our religious beliefs compel us towards not hiring gay people, then the courts have ruled that they are protected, that that type of discrimination, which in other cases would be illegal, becomes legal because their right to free expression of religion allows them to do that. Basically, it would be a violate. What Valley would argue is that it's a violation of our religious beliefs to force us to hire gay people because we believe religiously that being gay is bad or something. I don't know. So it's a problem, right? Because what that means is that something which is illegal in other, like if someone is gay, their right not to be discriminated against is being violated. On the other hand, if you force people to hire people that they find to be religiously objectionable, then their rights are being violated. So it becomes a really complex topic because one or the other either wins and the one or the other either loses. Somebody's rights are being violated in one way or the other. And the courts have really, really strongly not wanted to like step on the toes of any kind of religious freedom argument. Typically, all you have to do to get your way in the courts is to argue that it's a religious issue, and then pretty much you win, which kind of sucks. So that's why there are no openly gay teachers at Valley. It's because of this amendment.
Right. So, as Mr. Kistler explained, basically, like, religious grounds can be a way to kind of avoid things like non-discrimination laws, you know. And moving on to the third, which is federal funding for religious nonprofits and parochial schools. And so, grants and partnerships with religious charities occur within the government. And so these could be seen as, issues because, again, it can be seen as favoritism towards certain religions. So things like this have to be kind of carefully done, as well as federal student funding that is used to pay tuition at religious schools and colleges. Again, like they have to not show favoritism for it to be not a violation of freedom of religion, because if they show favoritism, it means that there is some discriminatory nature towards the action, and therefore is infringing on a different religion's rights. Does anyone have anything to add? All right, I'll move on to the next slide, which is freedom of speech. So first off, let's talk about campaign finance. So a lot of case law indicates that while economic activity can be considered a form of speech, campaign contributions must be limited to prevent corruption. And this was overturned in Citizens United versus the FEC, which overturned that precedent. And when we think of campaign finance, we have to think of, how do these, if there is a limitation on how much a person can donate to a candidate, then how do these candidates create such large campaigns? And the workaround for this was the creation of super PACs, which is a PAC is a political action committee. And a super PAC is a large independent political action committee, which is not limited as to, and with these super PACs, people are not as limited to how much they can donate because they're an independent organization who can support whatever whatever candidate they choose. And the super PAC can advocate as much as they want for a candidate, but cannot necessarily work directly with a candidate. So, for example, in the 2008 election, Mitt Romney had a lot of super PACs working for him, or rather working in his favor. And although his campaign was quite large, it was not necessarily all through his organization. It was through many super PACs, which allowed people to donate however much they wanted without the issues coming up about limitations on how much a person can contribute to a campaign.
So one way to think about this is think about like a soccer team, like a professional soccer team, like Manchester United or something like that. There's a bunch of rules that the league places upon that team about what they can and can't do, how much money they can spend on players, what uniforms they can wear, how much noise they can play on the field, etc. But usually with these big soccer teams, you also have these large associations of supporters, right? These Manchester United fans. They have completely independent organization, Man U fans and fans of Manchester United, and all these supporting people. They can organize as much money as they want. They have unlimited funding. They can meet anywhere they want for a rally. They can wear whatever uniforms they want. And when they go to the games, well, imagine that they're allowed to bring air horns into the stadium and vuvuzelas and blow them constantly to irritate the other team. That is essentially what a super PAC is. There's no official connection between the candidate's campaign, the official organization, like Biden for America or Trump, for America or whatever. There's no official connection. However, these large independent organizations work in parallel for the exact same goals that candidate is trying to accomplish. And because they're not technically associated, Citizens United versus FEC was a Supreme Court decision that said, oh, they can receive infinite amounts of money from corporate donors. Not only that, but they don't have to disclose their donor list to the public, because official campaigns have limits on how much they can accept, and they have to publish public lists of whoever donates. So it's a matter of public record, so you can track it down. So what ends up happening, it becomes real sneaky. It's not just that these super PACs are in favor of a given candidate. A lot of times they will register as being in favor of a particular issue set. So they'll say, okay, we are a super PAC that wants to promote lower taxes. We're the low taxation super PAC. Or we're the super PAC that wants to promote gun ownership. We're the NRA super PAC. So they can receive infinite amounts of money from corporate donors. They don't have to disclose their lists. And then when an election comes along, imagine that there's a Republican and a Democrat on the ballot. These super PACs start running ads on Facebook. They start running them on local TV. They start adding them on Instagram. And these ads never mention the candidates' names, but they'll say something like, Democrats want to strip your babies from you. Democrats want to take away your guns and turn you into a fascist socialist hellhole. Or Republicans want to shoot up your school and put guns in the hands of toddlers. Is that what you want? You see how they never mention the candidate's name? But they run ads based upon the candidate's platform positions, advocating for one issue set or another, riling up people's support so that when they go to vote, they will have all those campaign ideas in their heads. So that's a way that you do something which is basically profoundly corrupt, because now these massive, billionaires, trillionaires, corporations can influence policy and politics and basically bribe public officials by donating to campaigns which benefit that official without ever being officially associated with it. So it's kind of sneaky, but apparently it's completely legal, which is why you've seen so much corruption since Citizens United versus FEC.
Right. And then moving on to copyright protections, we can see here that original copyright law was designed not only to protect intellectual property, but also ensure that the artistic and cultural expression was not impeded by needless litigation. So, you know, to prevent people from constantly getting sued because, oh, I had a similar idea, you know, in a dream 3 weeks ago. It's like, well, yeah, but did you put it on a paper? Did you send it to someone else? Like, to prevent all of that, you know, unneeded, kind of useless litigation, copyright laws were invented. And, you know, they create limitations on it. So, you know, sunset periods and, you know, expirations for the IP rights and copyrights, you know, to prevent someone from always having hold on a certain idea or product, etc. But still to protect someone's intellectual property, because that could be considered a freedom of speech or expression, is that, you know, I've created this product or I've created this idea or something of the sort. And so the Copyright Act of 1967 differentiates between the idea and the expression of the idea expression dichotomy. And so this means that while a phone's specific OS can be considered IP, the idea of the features included in the OS cannot. So let's say, for instance, Samsung creates a screen recording feature within their OS, and they do this in like 2005. Now in 2010, Apple says, well, you know, our customers are asking for screen recording abilities, and so they can use this feature because although it was created, or although it was part of the OS from Samsung 5 years prior, the feature cannot be copyrighted, but the specific OS which Samsung created can be. So this is how a lot of companies kind of not really share, but kind of appropriate ideas from each other, because as long as the feature can be similar yet distinct, it creates no copyright issues.
The concept here, right, is that we want to protect people's freedom of speech. And freedom of speech, when you really think about it, is more like a freedom of idea, right? All speech really is an expression of an idea. So the reason why there was a 70-year sunset period for copyrights is because they wanted to say, as long as a person is alive, they should have the rights to their own thoughts. But there was no intention whatsoever that once that person died, that suddenly their thoughts would continue to belong to their kids or their progeny or to like a company. It just wasn't really the intention whatsoever. So that's why copyright is supposed to sunset after 70 years. But the Walt Disney Corporation decided, well, our whole business is based upon ideas and thoughts. So even after Walt Disney died, they lobbied Washington to try to extend the sunset period for like 150 years beyond that or something. Like, it's crazy now because within law, within constitutional law, there's two fundamentally different categories of rights. One is the right to ideas, and the second one is the right to property. So there's a huge distinguishment between rights and commercial activity. And the rights of ideas are protected extremely heavily in the Constitution. Rights to property, commercial activity, is not as strongly protected. But we're going to see a lot of mixing and matching of that over the years as like the economy as businesses and capitalism start to like become more and more powerful. The line between those becomes blurred. And now, because a company can own an idea and make a profit off of it, they're able to extend their protections of that way, way beyond the actual like lifetime of the actual person that had the idea. So that's what's happening here. Basically, corporate encroachment or commercial encroachment upon what's supposed to be an individual's right to expression, not a corporation's right to own the idea.
Right. So then The next would be exceptions of free speech. And this is really important because a lot of topics in debate, when they talk about free speech, um, you really have to get into what was actually said, because although something sounds like it could be a, you could, your case could be saved because you say, right to free speech, not everything is protected under free speech. So the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that the advocacy to use force or to incite imminent lawless action is not considered protected speech, but incite. So, however, the mere advocacy of violence is still generally protected. So, kind of like if I see, or like, I'm going to use myself in this example. It's like if I say I want that building burned down and then someone goes and burns it down, I could be held liable for that because I said I want something to happen and someone committed that act. And I'm basically advocating the use of force to, burn a building down, or the use of,
Well, to be more precise, Mohan, if you say, I want that building to be burned, actually, you're probably protected because all you're doing is expressing a thought that an outcome would be desirable. But if you turn to your friend and say, let's go burn down that building, or you should go burn down that building, and then he goes and does it, that's incitement because you have advocated for an imminent lawless act. Basically, you have told them right now you should go do this thing. That is incitement, and it's not considered protected speech.
Right. So what Mr. Kisser said is correct. That my example of saying I want this building burned down is actually would be kind of protected under the free speech because I'm advocating for a violent act to occur, but I'm not telling someone to actually go do it. However, if I say, I want, Ryan to go burn down this building and he does it, then I would not be protected because I told him specifically, like, you go burn this building down. Another example of something that's not protected would be something like language designed to result in an imminent breach of the peace, and also known as like things called fighting words. So that would not be considered free speech because it could cause imminent violence, but it has to be imminent violence. It cannot be like imminent meaning something happening soon, quickly, etc. So
if I'm at a bar, right, and I'm in someone's space, I'm like, this happens sometimes. People get drunk and like, I'm going to go to your house and I'm going to kill your children. And then that dude takes a swing. The reality is he probably actually has the law on his side because I've used fighting words, language designed to result in an imminent breach of the peace, meaning I'm trying to start a fight with my language. And when the fight starts, I am held liable for that violence. So it's a little bit different than saying go burn down that building. It's like I use an ethnic slur or something to try to start a fight. Using the ethnic slur in general would be protected speech. But if I'm using it with the intent to create a riot, to create a fight, to create a breach of the peace, some kind of chaos, then that's not protected speech and I can be prosecuted for it.
Right. And so as Mr. Kisser said, like basically using those words to be like provocative in the sense of causing a fight is the issue, or is the reason why it would not be protected. Now, moving on to obscenity and things like child pornography, these would not be considered speech nor expression, and they're not determined to have any artistic or social value, which is a good thing. But it's basically important to know that, obscenities, although not necessary, or although they may be in many people's vocabulary, are not really, or sorry, not obscenities, but
Obscenity is kind of a difficult word. It means really the expression of anything which is considered obscene. Now, what does obscene mean? It means something that is revolting, designed to provoke, break societal norms so profoundly. So this could be words, right? What this means basically is you don't have an absolute right to use cuss words in every situation. That's why, certain movies, you can restrict people from viewing them because they have obscenities in them, right? So if anyone is beneath the age of 13, you don't have the absolute right to go view a movie that has obscenity. Another example would be obscenity is like walking around naked in public or something, right? Because you are expressing something with your body which violates, societal norms profoundly and offends people. You don't necessarily have an absolute right to, behave in a way that's, public defecation, public urination. The reason why you can be prosecuted for peeing in public is not only destruction of property, but also potential obscenity charges. That's why.
Right. And so moving on to copyright infringement and commercial speech. Copyright infringement would be, infringing on things that are protected intellectual property and things that have been copyrighted. And commercial speech is things like print ads, ads on television, radio broadcasts, things meant to advertise or things like, or create awareness. Those are not protected as they are thought to be acts of commerce rather than acts of free speech. And so because they are considered acts of commerce, they can't be considered under free speech, although you may be speaking or, expressing in some way. It's not that they are considered speech and not protected. They're just not considered, free expression.
Right. They're not under the same category as like political expression, religious expression, etc. So if you're making a YouTube video in which you're using clips from, I don't know, Walt Disney Pictures and putting it together, you can get a copyright strike. And you say, well, what? I have the right to free speech. Shouldn't I have the right to be creative and express my thoughts? It's like, yes, unfortunately, the material that you're using is owned as a commercial asset by Disney. And if you're using it in a way that is commercially oriented, then essentially the courts will say, or the law will say, you're stealing objects, you're stealing assets from them rather than expressing an idea. Now, let's imagine that you were making a protest video in which you're advocating for a particular policy, and then you used like music from Moana in it. Now it gets a little bit stickier because the explicit intent of your video is political in nature and is protected under free speech, but you're using commercial assets owned by the Walt Disney Corporation, and that's where it gets kind of tough. Like, it's actually, the law is not super clear about using commercial asset for political speech.
Right. So then moving on to our next topic, which is freedom of the press. Now, prior restraint would be things like if the government knows that like a press organization has certain documents to which the government might find objectable, the government may try to prevent the publication, but they may not. So the government may not attempt to prevent the publication of content it finds objectionable through injunction. And so if the publication breaks laws, then they can pursue legal action and try and prosecute. Especially like when they're like when the publication breaks laws. But exceptions to this include things that the publication may deem necessary for people to hear and dangerous to national security, such as things like the Pentagon Papers, which were classified files about the Vietnam War. And so this justification is always controversial, as the government may not disclose exactly how national security could be endangered. So it's kind of hard to justify because the government cannot, or probably may not, disclose how the national security could be endangered, but they can still, like, the case can still be made.
So in general, the freedom of the press can be infringed by the government in two ways, like we're saying, or not can be, but the government usually tries to interfere with the press in one of two ways. Either they try to prevent the press from publishing the information in the first place, which we call prior restraint, or they let them publish it, but then they prosecute it afterwards. And the legal standard for prior restraint is extremely high. Because the freedom of the press is not supposed to be infringed, if the government wants to stop the press from publishing something, they have to demonstrate an extraordinary high level of standard to argue essentially, if you release this information in your newspaper or whatever, you will do irreparable harm to the US government, to US citizens. And so that's what they argued in the Pentagon Papers. Say, you can't release these classified documents that have been leaked to you because you will harm national security. Of course, this is very suspicious because if it's national security, if it's like classified, then the government obviously couldn't explain why it's classified and why it's important. So all the government has to do is claim, you can't publish that because it's classified. The press is like, why is it classified? And they're like, oh, we can't tell you, that's classified. So the government, in this case with the Pentagon Papers, which was not really that important, it took place like a decade after Vietnam, but it revealed damaging information about the government and caused a lot of embarrassment. The government tried to impose prior restraint on the publishing of the papers and took them to court. So like, if you publish this, it will hurt national security. And the courts ruled, actually, it doesn't. It's just embarrassing to you. So that's a little trick that the government tries to use when they want to cover up something, is they claim that the information cannot be released because it's classified, but there's no way to verify that because if it's classified, it's behind a dark wall.
Right. And so another thing that's important is that although the government may not attempt to prevent the publication of content it finds objectionable, the government may also not attempt to prevent the publication of content it finds objectionable through things like freezing or chilling strategies. And so a freezing strategy would be something like denying a permit for a controversial film because it can be exhibited in theaters. And a chilling strategy would be something like consistently suing or investigating newspapers who happen to publish unflattering information about members of the government, knowing that the suit will fail in a court, but be costly to the newspaper or news organization to deal with. So the government may not do these things because it's just another way of preventing a publication from doing something.
Right. So we saw examples of all of this over the last 4 years because there was this adversarial relationship or a perceived adversarial relationship between the executive branch, Trump's government, and the press. He did his best to try to infringe the freedom of the press through chilling and freezing strategies. So an example of a freezing strategy would be, because the Washington Post was publishing unflattering information about Trump basically directs the federal government to block a business deal or a merger that they wanted to do with another company. Or I say, oh, well, if you're going to publish nasty things about me, I'm going to interfere with your business. A chilling strategy would be to say, every time to try to force Facebook to provide more favorable coverage to conservative voices, they call Mark Zuckerberg to Washington every other week to have him testify before a congressional committee. You see how they're not arresting anybody per se, and they're not even accusing anyone of breaking laws, but they're making things so difficult and annoying for the press that it causes the press to self-censor just to try to avoid trouble. So that's what a chilling strategy is, and it results in infringement of the press, even though it doesn't technically meet the legal standard.
And so moving on to defamation through slander and libel. So for slander or libel to be proven, the statement must be false, cause harm, and be inadequately verified. So for a public official, it must be made with like reckless disregard for the truth. So kind of like when like organizations such as QAnon spread information about certain people within the government and say like, oh, they're running like child sex slave rings and, they're made of, they're lizards from Mars and they wear human skin. It's like these things would be considered slander and libel because first of all, or well, for these things to be considered slander and libel, they have to be, first of all, false. Second of all, they must cause harm, and they must be inadequately verified. So, you know, those are obvious examples, but Mr. Hessler, do you have any like more nuanced examples?
Sure. So right now, Rudy Giuliani is being sued by, what's the name of the voting machine company? Dominion, I think. So there's a company that makes digital voting machines called Dominion. And in the aftermath of the election, Rudy Giuliani, and a bunch of the other people on the legal team made all of these false statements to say that Dominion voting machines were compromised by Venezuelan hackers, or they were being replaced, and basically casting doubt on the validity and legitimacy of the Dominion voting machines. Well, the problem is that such an accusation is false and causes harm, because if people begin to think that voting machines made by this company are not legitimate, right? If they don't function correctly, the Dominion loses a ton of reputation, and they lose business, and they collapse. So it can cause a ton of harm to them. And also it has to be inadequately verified, which means like they did no research on it. They just flung the accusation at them. So Dominion decided to hit Rudy Giuliani with a $1.3, I think, billion defamation lawsuit, which is basically slander and libel. Say, because you made all these false statements that caused us harm, you've harmed our business, and so we seek repercussions. And of course, Dominion knows that he doesn't have the money, but the whole point here is to send a strong message that you can't just fling this kind of accusations around. Another example of this would be, there's this one guy that works for the vote counting committee in Pennsylvania, that it was spread online that actually he was seen like stuffing ballots or putting some in the car. He got death threats over it, which again is false, cause harm, and must be inadequately verified. So anytime you're using words which you know to be false and hurt another person, you can be actually liable for it, which means you are not protected by freedom of the press or freedom of speech, because you're doing stuff that causes harm. That last notice for a public official, what that means is if you are using words about someone who is in the public eye, for it to be defamation, slander, and libel, you actually have to meet an extra standard. Because what they didn't want to have happen is that you and I, let's say, Biden is he's a lizard guy. And then suddenly, because you and I are just kind of shooting the crap, we get prosecuted for it. The concept is that public officials, because they're in the public eye, have to take a little bit more crap from people. Like, it's okay to lie a little bit more about public officials because they're in the public eye. So for it to be slander and libel against a public official, it has to be false, cause harm, inadequately verified, and has to be demonstrated that it was made with a reckless disregard for truth. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a casual problem. It was that you kind of intentionally tried to lie and you didn't care.
So moving on to the next, which is freedom of assembly. So the First Amendment protects peaceful protest, and the government may not restrict the right of any group to peaceably assemble or protest in a public area. The keyword here is peaceably. And there are some questions. So what if a protest turns violent or has a history of violent protest? So something important about this is that although a organization may have a history of violent protest, if a protest is peaceful at the moment, it is not they are within their rights to protest. However, once a protest turns violent, then things get a little bit more gray because of the fact that there is violence occurring at the protest.
And you also have to ask yourself what quality of violence is required for it to no longer be peaceable. So, for example, if there's a protest and somebody knocks over a trash can, is it not peaceable anymore? If someone commits an act of vandalism by spray painting, a cop car, It breaks the law, but does that make it violent, or is it not? Is violent and not peaceable the same thing? Right? It's hard to know. Let's say that 99.99% of the protest is peaceful, and then there's a couple people that roll up, like, that want to cause some trouble, and they're being violent, but everyone else is being peaceful. Then is that protest now violent by association, and are they subject to the same repressive tactics? So it's actually kind of hard to determine what is and what is not a peaceful protest.
Yeah, actually, Mr. Gisler, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So let's say that a protest is peaceful, but doing things which are intimidating, such as like people marching with guns or people marching with like torches, are those considered peaceable protests?
Right. This is difficult. So if there were a group of people marching with guns in a state, county, or municipality in which open carry was illegal, then by the act of carrying guns, it would be breaking the law, and that would be an intimidating act. Thus, you could probably break up the protest for being unlawful. However, if you're in a state or locality in which open carry is permitted, and there's reason to suspect that the vast majority of members of the protest have open carry permits, then by them walking down the street with guns, it's like them walking down the street with like chia pets or with lanyards or funny hats. They're just objects, and thus you kind of have to give them the benefit of the doubt. So that's the wild thing, that the exact same protest in one state can be peaceable and in another state can be violent.
I see. Okay, so then moving on to the second question, which is, what if the group advocates for violence on their platform or things like a white ethno-state or ethnic cleansing? See, this is important because when you talk about like a peaceable protest or a peaceable assembly, a group of people standing in a park, protesting or assembling is fine. However, like let's say that their leader is advocating for ethnic cleansing. If they stay peaceful, is that still a peaceful protest or a peaceable assembly? And the answer is that yes, although it is a peaceable assembly, the advocacy of ethnic cleansing or a white ethno-state, those things could be a violation of outside the rights that are afforded by earlier parts of the First Amendment. So, or for example, if a group has assembled in a park and the leader is saying, like, let's go do this, let's go, commit these crimes, and crimes are then committed, that assembly may have been peaceful, but the speech at that assembly was not protected within the First Amendment.
Right. It's really complex. So when it comes to assembly, I think it's helpful to sort of separate out the means or the way that people are assembling and what they are assembling for. Right. So what characterizes the assembly and what is their goal? And you can have a assembly which is peaceful in its methodology, but is violent in its goal. So this would be a group of neo-Nazis peaceably assembling to advocate for genocide. It's just pretty wild to think about, but under the First Amendment, their speech is protected. You could alternatively have a group of people advocating for just hugging people more, just like a demonstration for hugs, and they do so by smashing car windows. Okay, well, their goals are peaceful, but their methods are not. So they're not protected under peaceful assembly, even though in the end, like probably the Nazi group is the one that's just more harmful to society. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. So then the next question will be, what venues are considered public, and is that, or could we consider that to be any property that receives public funding? So what's important about this question is like what venues are actually considered public. Like some people made the argument that the protest, like I'll call it a protest just for this example, But the protest at the Capitol building on January 6th, they're like, well, this is a federal building and my taxes paid for this, so I'm allowed to be here, and this is a public building. And it's kind of, the line gets blurred because, going to the Capitol building and protesting at or inside it is very different than protesting in, your local park or, a roadway, etc.
Or even protesting on the mall in front of the Capitol building is quite obviously public property. It's in public. You have the right to protest on the mall in front of the Capitol building. But in the Capitol building seems like a different thing. But why is it a different thing? It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It definitely is. But the question is why.
So obviously, we can use our own logic to discern that one place has more importance and more reverence than the other, and other things like that. But at the same time, the line is still very gray. So this is one reason why it's important to know like what venues, or to define what venues are considered public. Like if you were to debate this, that the definition works in favor of you by saying, well, this is not this should not be considered public for these reasons, or etc. And then the fourth question would be, are public universities obligated to host public protests, even if the cost is prohibitive, or if there are safety concerns for its students? Now, to answer this question, first, let's answer safety concerns of students. This would be a pretty easy way to argue against by saying that, if this possibly hostile or possibly intimidating protest could occur, although peaceful, could cause safety concerns for students. And it kind of depends on a school's like bylaws and rules. However, in a debate, you can make the argument that the safety concern for the students, who are typically the ones living there, working there, etc., go above the right to protest if their concern is safety-wise. However, the cost being prohibitive is a bit more difficult because they are still, or I guess this could also be grouped into like, is this venue still considered public? Because although it receives public funding, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily should or allowed to protest at that place. Just as the Capitol building receives public funding, doesn't mean that you're allowed to go inside, without being permitted. So, Mr. Kistler, what do you think?
Yeah, in terms of like public universities, this is where it gets really squidgy, because public universities are funded by public funds. California State University or UC Berkeley, et cetera. But UC Berkeley in particular has become a sort of favored venue for protest, whether, typically pretty far left groups kind of see Berkeley as an epicenter of their culture. And as a result, far right groups like to go there to try to agitate them. Basically, they're like, we're going to go into the lion's mouth and show those hippies what's up. And so there have been, pre-COVID, there were clash after clash after clash of protesters and counter-protesters on UC Berkeley campus. And the problem is that every time there's a scheduled demonstration on the campus, it costs the university a ton of money because they have to like hire a bunch of police officers for the weekend. They have to put up barriers and crowd control measures. They have to block off access. They have to clean up after the protest because a lot of times there's destruction. And then there's like students on campus that, just trying to go to school, or sometimes they're living on campus in the dorms. And so how would you like it if this political clash between two opposing groups kept taking place in their front yard every weekend? You have to clean it up afterwards. So UC Berkeley and the Berkeley PD is basically try to put a kibosh on it, saying, okay, no more protests. Like, this is ridiculous. And there were suits levied against them saying, well, we have a constitutional right to assembly. It's a public university, therefore it's a public square. Therefore, this is the site that we get to do it on. And it's really difficult because a public university is both a public place, but it's also in some ways a private place because people live there, go to work there, go to school there.
Right.
So it becomes really difficult to kind of understand what role a university campus plays. Like, it's quite obvious that the National Mall in Washington, D.C. is a public place. It's quite obvious that my bathroom is a private place, but there's plenty of other like spaces in between that don't fully fall into one category or another. And so governments have to be really, really careful about what they prohibit and what they allow. What they typically try to do is fall on the side of more freedom versus less. They will usually try to accommodate public protest. But at some point, you got to recognize that, you know, if you have a far right group coming to Berkeley every weekend just to like punch Antifa, and Antifa shows up for the same reason, this isn't really public speech, right? It's just a venue for a brawl. So how much are you allowed to infringe upon that without doing any damage? It's honestly really, really tough to figure out.
Right. And so the final question would be, does a private entity like the NFL or a private university have the constitutional right to fire or punish an employee for participating in a public act of protest, or is this an infringement of their free speech rights? So I think one big example would be like Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, and then that causing issues within between him and his team, and between him and the NFL league. So I think that as we've explained before, first off, if you consider a kneel during a national anthem being a expression, then it would be considered protected under the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. However, I think a key word here is a public act of protest. So let's say, for instance, that Colin Kaepernick did not kneel on the field, but rather went to a protest on his free time. It probably would not have caused as much issue with a private entity like the NFL. But the fact that it occurred on the private property of the NFL and during things like when the NFL was filming, I think that it can be considered differently. Would you agree, Mr. Kistler?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is where I get kind of confused in my own moral intuition, because when I look at Colin Kaepernick kneeling on the field for racial justice, my instinct is to say, yes, that happened. I say, that's bad. You shouldn't be fired from an act of political protest. But then at Charlottesville, he had a bunch of these white supremacist Nazi dudes. They go there, they get photographed, they come back to their jobs at a hot dog stand. Their employer, or for example, Valley Christian, you find out that like one of our teachers is on neo-Nazi chat boards, and they get fired because they're like, well, you don't represent the brand. And I say, yes, they should be fired because they are bad people. But here's the problem. If I agree that Colin Kaepernick should not be fired for political protest, and I agree that a teacher should be fired for an act of political activism or whatever, then I'm actually not applying the same legal standard. I'm merely just, I don't know, I'm using my own feelings and prejudices to like differentiate. I'm saying like one is good and one's not.
Right.
So it's like you kind of have to be careful about how much your own moral intuition or your own I guess taking sides influences the way that you apply these like rights to protest.
Mm-hmm.
It's so complicated because there's rules and then there's like morals, and sometimes they don't line up with each other.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And especially like in a debate, this can get very difficult because of how much moral ambiguity there can be in relation to the legal precedents. So, any questions? And feel free to type them in the chat or just speak. Either is fine.
So the resolution that we kind of base this off of, there was a resolution at Evergreen which talked about this rapper and activist from Spain who was basically being arrested because in his lyrics,
he advocated for violence against members of the government and of the state, and he basically also at rallies would use like, we should kill the president, we should murder, like in his lyrics, we should murder this guy and this guy, and so he was arrested for it. So the question is, should he be let go or should he not? So what do you think about that? If there is a musician who in his lyric names a political figure by name and says we should kill him, is that his right under free speech, or is he committing a crime? What do you think?
I'll let someone else answer this one.
There's no necessarily right or wrong answer. That's what the debate was about. Well,
okay, if you go under the definition of American Constitution, then we have to think about, first of all, the harm that could come from letting speech occur, but at the same time, if the censorship occurs, are we protecting people's right to speak freely?
Right.
I think another thing is, which gets complicated, is you have to think of intent and then actual action that occurred and things like that. So
consider an alternative example. There's that song, I think it's by Nipsey Hussle, and it's called F Donald Trump. I'm sure you've all heard of it. F Donald Trump, right? And that's just the whole lyric, just repeating it over and over again. Is that incitement to violence, or is it protected under free speech?
Well,
well, actually, I'm asking someone else, Mohan.
Sorry.
Sorry. A song by a rapper in which the refrain simply says F Donald Trump. It's a public figure. Is that lyric free speech, or is that lyric prosecutable?
I mean, he's not saying that Donald Trump should go die and get shot in the head, so I guess it's free speech. But like the Spanish dude was like literally talking about how politicians should get shot in the back of the head.
Right. So the F Donald Trump example, you could imply, I hate this guy and I wish harm upon him, but because it is not an explicit advocacy of explicit means of violence, it can be taken as an artistic form of expression. It's merely an expression to say, I petition my government for redress of grievances. Basically, they're saying like, I disagree with his policies. I do not care for his personalities, which is completely free speech. But the more specific you get about the means of violence and the object of violence, suddenly you start getting into incitement, because the more specific the threat is, the more likely it is to occur. Thus, that kind of speech is probably not protected by free speech. So that's a good distinction. Specificity is important. All right, how about when Trump stands up at the Capitol and says, Mike Pence didn't do what it took to save our republic, and so we're going to go down to the Capitol and we're going to try to give our brave senators the courage that they need to do what they need to do. That's interesting, because although he does not explicitly advocate for violence, he does advocate for immediate action towards breaking the law, right? And as soon as he said that, people went and did it and violence occurred. So that's why the case for incitement is a little bit stronger in that case, but there are some questions, because unlike the Spanish rapper who explicitly said we should shoot him in the back of the head, Trump merely said we should go to the Capitol and show them what we think, which is not exactly the same, right? So this stuff is real complicated. The point that I'll have, because we're wrapping up here, I know we're over time, is that I got a lot in the group text this weekend. It was a lot of panicking, like, how can I possibly argue against free speech? How can I possibly argue for this? How can I argue against freedom of assembly? And what we're trying to show you here is that you can argue for and against it because they're not that clear. The rules around it are just not that clear. And so because they're not clear, you should be able to find an angle to use in which you affirm the principles of free speech, free expression, free assembly, and then freedom of the press, while also showing that the particular case that you're giving by the resolution does not fit that description. That's the whole point. Was the question in the chat like, how come we're using American laws, or how can we talk about resolutions in Spain?
Yeah. So the question was, if resolutions are asking about other countries like the Spain resolution, should we use the Constitution and American laws as examples, or are we just supposed to use the other countries' laws? And in examples of other countries, use their laws. So this is more applicable to countries that have laws like freedom of speech, and countries that, or the U.S. So, in certain countries, speech is more censored. So the rules kind of change. But I would say that for a lot of, again, this is not just about freedom of speech. This is about the entire First Amendment. So like even vaccines could be applied under this.
You also have to consider too that the UN Commission on Human Rights has like a bunch of resolutions in which they say all countries' laws should comply with the protection of these particular rights. And what's interesting is because the United States is a leader in the world, and because our Constitution is a model for a lot of other people, the UN Commission on Human Rights uses almost the same language and the same principles from the Constitution in their resolutions as well. And so if you can't make the argument that we should cross-apply US Constitution to Spain, you could say, but the UN Commission on Human Rights also affirms our commitment towards free speech, free expression, free assembly. Thus, if Spain passes a law that contradicts that, they're in violation of UN rules. And that's a problem as well. We want to affirm universal human rights, and the UN is the means by which we do that. Okay, I'm done. You guys done?
Yeah. Thank you all for attending, and we'll upload this so you can review if you would like.
All right, bye y'all. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Hey,
Mr. Stifler. Thank you, Mohan.
Thanks, Mohan. Good job.
All right.
Good meeting everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
We're just dropping off, Mohan.
Or I don't think there's anything to address. Just really quick, let me stop real quick.